Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and good to see you up there.
Good to see you as well, sir. Please proceed.
Thank you. A few questions to the proponent, if I may.
Yes, you may. Please go.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Speaker, the first question is in regards to this strike-all amendment as compared to the previous underlying bill. It's my understanding that this now restricts the Styrofoam ban to a limited amount of entities. So through you, is that correct? And if so, could the good proponent please expand on that?
Representative D'Amico.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Yes, the gentleman is correct. The original legislation that came out of the Environment Committee was more broad-based, and it involved food service establishments to a much larger degree. And this amendment limits the ban beginning in 2021 to restaurants and caterers. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Harding.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and through you, Mr. Speaker. I know that during the committee we did receive some testimony from some local manufacturers that manufacture Styrofoam. They did have some concerns about whether or not this ban would impact the way they produce and distribute Styrofoam and Styrofoam containers. So there was some concern about that. And through you, Mr. Speaker, I'm looking to see if that amendment addresses this amendment addresses that particular issue. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative D'Amico.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. In answer to the gentleman's question, the lines 44 through 46 of the amendment indicate that the manufacture and sale of single-use containers by other than a restaurant or a caterer is not prohibited as a result of this legislation. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Harding.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And through you, Mr. Speaker, so since this is a strike-all amendment, if I may, Mr. Speaker, I'm just going to have some questions on the amendment in regards to the underlying bill, but it's a strike-all. So the intention of this amendment and the intention of the bill, my understanding was originally in committee, was to address consumers taking Styrofoam directly from restaurants. Not so much manufacturers and distributors, just individuals leaving restaurants, whether it be Dunkin' Donuts with a Styrofoam cup, whether it be a local restaurant, and individuals taking out burgers and fries in a Styrofoam container. So is that the good proponent's understanding of what this amendment does and what the intention of the underlying bill was? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative D'Amico.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I believe the gentleman is correct that in the committee we were concerned about single-use polystyrene containers from restaurants primarily. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Harding.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I know another concern that we did receive, I think, through CCM in committee is potentially some of the school systems that use Styrofoam trays. Fortunately, from what I'm hearing, it's getting more and more limited as to the school systems that still do use those trays. But there was a potential concern from CCM in regards to placing a municipal mandate through passing this. And so if the good proponent could explain how this amendment impacts potential schools in regards to a potential municipal mandate. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative D'Amico.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. In answer to the question, this amendment does not affect schools or nursing homes and other entities in any way. It is strictly limited to restaurants and caterers. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Harding. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I know that there was another concern as well from individuals that I've spoken with in regards to supermarkets. So Eggland's Best eggs, for example, I believe still use the Styrofoam trays. And there's some of the butchers or seafood markets within supermarkets occasionally will use Styrofoam for packaging some of their food. And so just through you, Mr. Speaker, I just want to make sure that this amendment also addresses those entities as well for legislative intent. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Harding. Oops. Representative D'Amico.
Much better looking.
It's certainly not an insult to be mistaken for my good ranking member, but thank you, Mr. Speaker. In answer to the gentleman's question, lines 22 through 27 address those concerns, those lines indicate that grocery stores, supermarkets will be able to do what the gentleman was describing as far as packaging raw meat and beef and seafood and so forth. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Harding.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the kind words, but much better looking Representative D'Amico, so it is an insult a little bit for you to be considered Representative Harding. Nevertheless, Mr. Speaker, if I may, I'm going to speak a little bit on this amendment, which is a strike all amendment, which will be ultimately the bill if it's passed. I appreciate the intent. I will support this amendment because I know that we received a substantial amount of testimony in regards to Styrofoam and the environmental impact, a very negative environmental impact it has on not only our local environment, but throughout the country. And so I do appreciate the step this is taking. I do have concerns, and I know many of my colleagues do have concerns, and I look forward to hearing from them later on in this debate. And I think part of it is restaurants that we're impacting through this. Many of them are small restaurants. They're mom and pop type of restaurants. They're small delis, etc. Many of them use Styrofoam because it is such a reduced rate as compared to the alternative. I was talking to Representative Ritigliano last night, who is a restaurant owner himself. I'm sure he may speak on this debate. And he was showing me some of the comparative pricing between Styrofoam and the cheapest alternative, and the numbers were quite astonishing to me. I didn't know that it was that wide of a gap. And so some of my colleagues, understandably, have some significant concerns regarding what the alternative will cost. And so, in my opinion, I think the environmental aspect of this bill supersedes those concerns, but nevertheless, they are warranted in regards to a lot of the mandates that we continue to push down upon some of these restaurants already. Some of the bills that have been passed this year for small business-owned, mom-and-pop type of restaurants to undertake a significant cost, an alternative cost, is quite alarming to some small businesses. So I certainly understand some of the concerns, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that going forward on this debate. I do want to thank the good chair, the good co-chair of this committee, Representative Borer, who I know has worked very hard on this bill and trying to make it a compromise piece of legislation that addresses the environmental concerns, which are significant, and also addresses some of the business and institutional concerns, which fortunately are addressed in this amendment. So I do want to mention quickly, I do support the amendment. I'm on the amendment. I believe it is a good compromise. So I hope my colleagues will support the amendment, but I look forward to hearing some of their comments in regards to the possible implication this may place on businesses and the price changes in regards to the supplies they utilize for takeout. So with that being said, I want to thank the good speaker for his time and thank the good chair for asking some of my clarifying questions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And if I may, Mr. Speaker, just a couple questions on the amendment through you.
Please proceed, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Through you, Mr. Speaker, so my understanding of the amendment, just to make it clear, is that the only change from the previous amendment that was filed and subsequently withdrawn was that we defined restaurant as it's defined in 19A-342 of the general statutes, and we defined caterer as it's defined in section 19A-36G of the general statutes. And additionally, the time frame for when this bill will take place is extended 6 months from the previously withdrawn amendment. Is my understanding correct through you, Mr. Speaker?
Representative D'Amico.
The gentleman is correct. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Harding.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and there's then no other changes to what was originally filed. The remaining body of the law and the legislation remains exactly the same. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative D'Amico.
That is correct. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Harding.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And so for that reason, I've spoken on this bill and some of the concerns that I have, as well as some of the reasons I support it. And so that generally remains the same. I want to thank the chairperson, the vice chairperson, for working with us on this compromise language. Additionally, in regards to further defining restaurant, further defining caterer, and also extending out the time frame for when this bill will be enacted to give restaurants a little more time to prepare and formulate their alternatives for these styrofoam containers. So I look forward to the further debate on this, and I want to thank the chair and vice chair for their work on this compromise amendment. I do support this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.